My voice was taken from me in that room. The doctor closed the file, turned his chair, and spoke to me like I no longer had a choice. My wife was still on the table when he leaned in and said I needed to leave her. Now, I tried to ask why. He shook his head. Something was already happening, and I couldn't stop it. I stayed in the chair after he said it, staring at the floor like it might explain what he couldn't. The ultrasound machine was still humming behind the curtain, my wife's voice drifting faintly as she joked with the technician. I felt invisible, dismissed, like a decision had already been made somewhere above my head. When I tried to stand, the doctor pressed his palm down gently, firmly, keeping me seated. That small touch told me everything had shifted. I knew then, whatever came next would not ask my permission, or wait for understanding from me alone ever again. There, sir. He asked me to step into the hallway, speaking softly, as if volume could change consequences. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing my wife inside without me. He didn't look angry or afraid, just careful, like a man choosing each word to avoid disaster. He said the ultrasound showed something that wasn't supposed to be there. Before I could ask what, he said my marriage was no longer safe. Turres. The sentence landed heavier than any diagnosis I had imagined hearing that morning, and it left me completely unprepared to respond as a husband or as a man at all. I tried to push back, telling him he couldn't say something like that without explaining. He finally met my eyes and said explaining too much would make things worse. He warned me not to confront her, not to show fear, not to tip anyone off. Every instruction stripped more control from me. I realized this wasn't medical advice anymore. It was a warning delivered too late to refuse. My hands were shaking, but I forced them still, afraid he was watching my reaction for signs of denial or dangerous loyalty that could ruin everything before it started without warning today. When we went back inside, my wife smiled at me, unaware of the space that had opened between us. The technician wiped the gel away and chatted about normal results, routine follow-ups. I nodded, played my part, and hated myself for it. The doctor avoided my eyes completely. I felt like a stranger watching my own marriage continue without consent. Each second stretched, thick with lies I was now required to carry alone. I wondered how long before silence itself became another betrayal that I would never explain without destroying something permanent inside all of us for good forever, maybe. We walked out together, her hand slipping into mine out of habit. I felt trapped by that familiar weight, terrified to pull away. In the car, she talked about lunch plans, about errands, about nothing that mattered anymore. I answered automatically, while replaying the doctor's words on a loop. Every red light felt like borrowed time. I kept wondering who else already knew and why I was the last to be warned. My role felt reduced to compliance. A husband present, but excluded from truth. That imbalance frightened me deeply, more than any diagnosis they could have given that day. At home, I watched her move through the kitchen, comfortable, trusting, unchanged. I wondered if she noticed how carefully I was studying her now. The doctor had said not to confront her, and that order echoed louder than fear. I realized obedience was being demanded from me. Whatever this was, it had already claimed authority. I felt like a witness to something unfolding without my consent. My instincts screamed, but I swallowed them down. Silence became my temporary shield, and possibly my greatest mistake, because silence can protect lies as easily as people who benefit from them eventually always do. That evening she asked why I seemed distant. I lied without practice, surprising myself. I said I was tired, overwhelmed, distracted. She accepted it too easily. That acceptance unsettled me more than suspicion would have. I began to wonder how many lies were already built into our life. Each shared routine suddenly felt staged, rehearsed, designed. I questioned memories I once trusted. Completely. Nothing collapsed, yet everything felt unstable. The ground hadn't moved, but I had. And I didn't know where to stand without making things worse, for reasons still hidden from me deliberately, by someone close, very close indeed. Late that night, I replayed the doctor's tone, not his words. It wasn't panic. It was urgency mixed with restraint. He had seen something that forced him to choose sides, and he had chosen mine, quietly, dangerously. I wondered what price he expected me to pay for that warning. Sleep refused me, as if rest itself was unsafe now. I stayed awake listening to my wife breathe. Each breath sounded normal, innocent, unchanged. That normality felt like the threat because it hid something enormous, just beneath my understanding waiting to surface when I was weakest, or unprepared to respond properly. By morning, nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything inside me was armed. I knew I was being tested, measured by my silence. Someone expected me to follow instructions without deviation, and if I didn't, something irreversible would happen. I didn't know what that was yet, but I felt it closing in. The doctor's warning wasn't over. It was unfolding. I sensed eyes on my decisions now. Each choice felt monitored. Each hesitation felt dangerous. I was no longer free to act, only to react under rules I hadn't agreed to, set by others inside my own home quietly. I woke up before she did, lying still, measuring my breathing so it matched hers. I didn't want to give away anything through habit or instinct. The house looked the same in the dim light, but it no longer felt like a place I understood. Every familiar sound felt rehearsed, as if the walls had learned to stay quiet for someone else. I kept thinking about how easily the doctor had taken control of my choices, with one sentence. That power lingered. I knew it hadn't ended when we left the clinic. At breakfast, she poured my coffee the way she always did. 2 sugars. No question. That small normalcy made my chest tighten. I watched her hands, wondering what the doctor had seen that I hadn't. She talked about errands and an upcoming appointment, casually mentioning she'd need to go back alone. That detail stuck with me. Alone meant without me, without questions. I nodded again, feeling myself shrink into a role that required compliance rather than partnership. I realized how quickly silence can become routine if you don't fight it immediately. After she left, I sat at the table longer than necessary, staring at the empty chair across from me. The doctor's words replayed, not louder, but sharper. You need to leave her. Not consider. Not prepare. Leave. I wondered what leaving meant in his mind. Physical distance? Emotional withdrawal? Legal separation? The lack of clarity felt intentional. I suspected he wanted me unsettled, cautious, easy to direct. I started to understand that information was being rationed, and I was being fed just enough to keep me obedient. I called the clinic under the excuse of a billing question, hoping to reach him again. A nurse answered instead, polite but guarded. When I asked to speak with the doctor, her tone shifted. She said he was unavailable and suggested I wait for follow-up instructions. The word confirmed my fear. This wasn't over. I asked if my wife's results required immediate attention. There was a pause, just long enough to matter. Then she said she couldn't discuss patient details and ended the call quickly, like she'd said too much by hesitating at all. The rest of the day dragged, thick with anticipation. I tried to distract myself with chores, but my mind kept circling the same question. What exactly was I being protected from, or worse, who? I thought about authority, and how easily we surrender to it. When fear enters the room, the doctor had authority. The clinic had authority. Even silence had authority now. I felt myself being shaped by it, responding instead of deciding. That loss of agency felt like the first real injury, one I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding paranoid or disloyal. When she returned home, she was unusually attentive, asking if I needed anything, touching my arm as she passed. I couldn't tell if it was affection or assessment. Every gesture felt loaded. I responded carefully. Afraid enthusiasm might look suspicious, and distance might invite questions I couldn't answer. I wondered if she sensed the shift already. The doctor had warned me not to confront her, but he hadn't said anything about her confronting me. That imbalance worried me more than silence. It meant she could act freely while I remained restrained by rules I hadn't agreed to. That night she mentioned the follow-up appointment again, casually stating the time had been changed. She didn't ask if I could come. She told me. The certainty in her voice felt new. I asked, "Why the change?" She said, "The doctor recommended it." That name tightened everything inside me. The same authority that had quietly undermined my marriage was now coordinating movements without me. I realized I was being managed. Not informed, not included, managed. The sense of being outnumbered settled in, and I didn't know how many people were involved or when it had started. Later, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The sound alone told me enough. Someone else was in motion. Someone else was communicating without me. The doctor had said not to tip anyone off. That instruction echoed louder now. I wondered what would happen if I broke it. Would the warning disappear? Would the danger accelerate? I felt trapped between ignorance and action, both carrying consequences I couldn't measure. I began to understand that waiting might be exactly what they wanted me to do. Sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept returning to the ultrasound image I hadn't seen, the one that had changed everything. I wondered if the doctor had shown her something different than what he'd told me, or if he'd shown her nothing at all. The possibility that I was the only one reacting to a truth no one else acknowledged made me feel isolated in my own home. I questioned whether the warning was about her condition or about her choices. That distinction mattered, and I had no way to clarify it without breaking the rules imposed on me. By the time morning came, I knew one thing for certain: this situation was moving whether I participated or not. Decisions were being made in rooms I wasn't invited into. My silence wasn't neutral. It was being used. I felt pressure building, not toward understanding but toward compliance. The doctor's warning had planted something inside me, and it was growing fast. I didn't know when I'd be forced to act, but I knew hesitation would soon stop being an option. Whatever line had been crossed, I was already standing on the wrong side of it. I decided that morning I would not ask questions that invited lies. I would watch instead, quietly, carefully, the way people do when they already suspect the truth. My wife moved through the house with purpose, checking her phone more than usual, answering messages I couldn't see. Each vibration felt like a signal sent around me, not to me. I realized observation was the only power left to me, and even that felt temporary. She left earlier than planned, saying the clinic wanted updated paperwork. The certainty in her voice left no room for discussion. I stood at the doorway, listening to her car pull away, noticing how quickly the house returned to silence. That silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt enforced. I wondered who else knew where she was going, and why no one thought I needed to be informed. I waited before doing anything, letting time stretch without naming it. I replayed the doctor's posture in my mind, how he had leaned closer when he warned me. That memory carried more meaning now. He had been afraid of interruption. I suspected whatever he saw on that screen had implications beyond medicine, something tied to decisions already underway. I drove to the clinic without announcing myself, parking farther away than usual. I told myself I was only there to understand, not interfere. The waiting room looked the same, yet I felt like an intruder. When I asked for the doctor by name, the receptionist hesitated before answering. That hesitation confirmed more than words ever could. She told me he was unavailable again, then suggested I leave a message. I declined and sat down instead, choosing visibility over compliance. I noticed a nurse glance at me, then quickly look away. That look carried recognition. I realized my presence mattered, even if no one wanted to admit it. Being seen was already an act of resistance. After a while, the doctor emerged from a side hallway, stopping when he saw me. His expression hardened for a moment before smoothing out. He didn't ask why I was there. He asked me to follow him. The request sounded polite, but his body blocked any alternative. I followed because refusal felt louder than obedience. Inside his office, he closed the door and spoke without sitting. He said, "My wife's condition was not the danger he was concerned about." That single sentence shifted everything. I asked what was. He said the ultrasound revealed evidence of something deliberate, not accidental, and not recent. He refused to elaborate further, saying timing mattered more than clarity. I pressed him, telling him I deserved to know. He replied that knowing too much would change how others behaved around me. That statement chilled me. It meant my ignorance was strategic. He said people reveal themselves when they think you're unaware. He advised me to keep watching, even if it felt unbearable, because confrontation would collapse whatever fragile advantage I still had. When I returned home, my wife was already there, calm, composed, almost relieved. She asked where I'd been. I told her I went for a drive. She studied my face longer than necessary, then nodded. I realized we were both performing now, measuring each other's responses, hiding intent behind routine conversation. The marriage had turned into a negotiation without terms. That evening she mentioned a legal document she needed help locating. Something old, something boring. The request felt casual, but my instincts screamed. I told her I'd look later. She didn't argue, which unsettled me more than resistance would have. It meant she expected access eventually. I wondered what deadline she was working against. Alone again, I thought about the word deliberate. The doctor had chosen it carefully. Whatever he'd seen wasn't a mistake or coincidence. It was planned. That realization reframed everything, including my role. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was an obstacle, one that needed to remain passive. That understanding hardened something inside me. I knew then that waiting was no longer neutral. It was a decision with consequences. Someone else was moving pieces into place, assuming I would stay predictable. I didn't know when the final move would come, but I felt it approaching. The danger wasn't hidden anymore. It was active, coordinated, and counting on my silence to succeed. As night settled, I understood that whatever happened next would test whether I remained a witness or became a problem. And I knew without certainty but with conviction that choosing wrong would cost me more than my marriage. It would cost me the truth itself. I stopped pretending that normal behavior would protect me. The moment I accepted that, something inside me steadied. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled my decisions. I began to understand that my wife wasn't acting randomly. Every calm smile, every casual request, every quiet pause had a direction. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was waiting for timing. That realization changed how I watched her. I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was looking for intent. That evening, she asked again about the document. This time she added a reason. Something about updating records. Something administrative and dull. The explanation came too easily. I told her I'd check the cabinet in the morning. She accepted the answer. But her eyes lingered. Not suspicious, calculating. It was the look of someone adjusting a plan, not abandoning it. I realized then that refusal didn't stop her. It only forced her to reroute. After dinner, she made a phone call from the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, close enough to hear tone but not words. Her voice stayed low, controlled, never rising or cracking. Whatever she was saying didn't require emotion. That frightened me. Emotionless conversations are usually about logistics, not feelings. When she came back out, she asked if I was tired. I said yes. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Sleep came in pieces. I kept waking to small sounds, convinced I was missing something important. At one point, I heard drawers open and close. I didn't move. I wanted to see what she'd do if she thought I was fully unaware. When the house went quiet again, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Nothing had happened yet, but yet was doing a lot of work. By morning, my patience was gone. Not in a loud way, in a focused way. I waited until she left the room, then opened the cabinet she'd mentioned. Inside were old folders, outdated policies, and one envelope I didn't recognize. It was thicker than the rest, sealed but worn at the edges, like it had been handled often. My name was typed on the front. That detail alone made my hands sweat. I didn't open it right away. I needed to understand why it was there first. I checked the surrounding folders, noticing how recently some had been rearranged. She'd been preparing, not reacting. Preparing. I took the envelope and placed it back exactly as I found it. Knowledge without context could be dangerous. The doctor had warned me about knowing too much too fast. For the first time, I understood why. Later, she asked if I'd checked. I told her not yet. She said it wasn't urgent, which told me it was. Urgent things only become not urgent when someone is trying not to apply pressure too soon. I nodded and changed the subject. She didn't push. That worried me more than insistence would have. It meant she had other options. In the afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. It asked if I was alone. I said yes. It told me to stay that way for now. Then it hung up. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a warning disguised as concern. I sat there holding the phone long after the call ended, feeling the perimeter of my life shrink further. When she came home, she was lighter than she'd been all week. Almost relieved. She talked more, laughed more, touched my shoulder as she passed. The sudden warmth felt strategic. I recognized it as reassurance designed to keep me compliant. I played along, matching her tone, offering smiles I didn't feel. We were both pretending for different reasons now. That night she placed the envelope on the table between us. She didn't slide it, she set it down gently, like an offering. She said she found it while organizing and thought we should go through it together. The word together felt rehearsed. I asked what it was. She said she wasn't sure. That lie was small but obvious. I told her I wasn't ready to discuss paperwork tonight. She studied me, really studied me, then picked the envelope back up and said we could wait. But her jaw tightened for just a moment before she turned away. That moment told me I'd delayed something important. I didn't know what the deadline was, but I knew I was pushing against it now, and pressure always pushes back. After she went to bed, I sat alone at the table, staring at the place where the envelope had been. I realized how close I was to becoming irrelevant in my own life. Decisions were being made, documents prepared, conversations held without me. My presence was tolerated, not required. That realization cut deeper than betrayal. Betrayal assumes value. This felt like erasure. I understood then that whatever the doctor had seen on that screen wasn't just medical. It was procedural. Procedural. Legal. Strategic. It was something that required silence, cooperation, and timing. And my wife was further along in that process than I was allowed to be. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here, unfolding quietly, waiting for me to either notice too late or resist at the wrong moment. As I finally stood up to turn off the lights, I knew one thing with certainty. The next move would not be hers. Or at least, it couldn't be. Because if I waited any longer, there would be nothing left for me to protect. Not my marriage. Not my name. Not even my voice. I didn't sleep at all after that. I lay there listening to the house breathe, feeling like a guest who had overstayed his welcome without realizing it. The realization that my name could be erased with paperwork sat heavy in my chest. This wasn't about love or illness anymore. It was about control. Someone was preparing for a version of the future where I was optional. And the worst part was how calmly it was being done, like routine maintenance rather than destruction. In the early quiet, I got up and made coffee. Not because I wanted it, but because routine still gave me cover. I replayed the doctor's warning again. Not his words, but his urgency. He hadn't told me to fight. He hadn't told me to confront. He'd told me to leave. At the time, I'd thought that meant distance from her. Now I understood. It might mean distance from the trap being built around me. When she woke up, she acted normal again, too normal. She mentioned a meeting she had later. Something vague, something that didn't include me. I nodded, pretending disinterest. Inside, I was mapping exits. Not physical exits yet, but informational ones. I needed to know what she thought she already had secured. Documents don't prepare themselves. Neither do witnesses. After she left, I went back to the cabinet. This time I didn't hesitate. I took the envelope out and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of documents, not originals. That detail mattered. Power of attorney forms, medical and financial. My signature appeared on them, shaky but convincing. I stared at it, my heart pounding, trying to remember when I could have signed something like that. I couldn't. The dates were recent, too recent. My name was there, but the decision wasn't mine. That was the theft, not of money, of agency. I finally understood the doctor's urgency. Once those documents were activated, my voice would legally disappear. Decisions about my care, my finances, even my residence could be made without me. Leaving wouldn't be abandonment. It would be survival. I took photos of everything and put the papers back exactly as I found them. Panic would be useful later. Right now, clarity mattered more. I sat down and forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each breath to keep my hands steady. Rage wanted to take over, but rage would make me sloppy. Sloppy men lose quietly. The phone rang again from an unknown number. This time I answered, without hesitation. The voice said my name and asked if I had found the documents yet. I didn't respond immediately. Silence felt like leverage now. The voice continued, telling me I needed to act before they were filed officially. When I asked who they were, the line went dead. That confirmed more than any explanation could. When she came home, she was tense. Not angry, alert. She asked how my day was. I told her it was quiet. She nodded, then asked if I'd gone through the cabinet. I said yes. Her eyes didn't widen. They softened, relief. That reaction told me she believed the papers were already enough. That belief was dangerous. At dinner, she mentioned seeing a lawyer soon, framed as planning, not preparation. I asked, "What for?" She said it was just to be safe. The word safe landed wrong. Safe from what? From me? From uncertainty? From resistance? I realized she believed she was justified. People doing terrible things often do. That night she tried to initiate closeness. I declined gently, blaming exhaustion. She didn't argue. She simply turned away. The distance between us felt formal now. Contractual. I stayed awake long after she slept, replaying every shared year, wondering when partnership had turned into procedure. I knew I couldn't stay much longer without becoming legally invisible. The doctor's warning finally made complete sense. Leaving wasn't betrayal. Staying was consent. And consent had already been forged once. I gathered what I needed quietly. Not bags. Not clothes. Evidence. Information. Proof that I still existed as a decision maker. I realized revenge wasn't my goal. Survival was. If justice came later, it would have to come cleanly, carefully, without giving her a chance to finish what she'd started. As dawn approached, I understood the shape of the danger fully for the first time. This wasn't a sudden act. It was a process, and processes rely on silence. I had been silent long enough. I didn't know yet who was helping her, or why the ultrasound had triggered this phase. But I knew one thing for certain. The moment I stepped out of that house, the story would no longer belong to her alone. And once that happened, everything she thought was settled would become unstable again. I left the house without announcing it. Not because I was afraid she would stop me, but because I needed to see what happened when I was no longer predictable. I didn't take much, just my wallet, my phone, and the weight of what I now knew. The door closed behind me with a softness that felt intentional, like the house itself was cooperating with whatever plan had been set in motion. For the first time in weeks, I felt exposed but also strangely alert. I drove without a destination at first, letting instinct guide me. I needed distance. Not miles, but separation from her timeline. I kept thinking about the ultrasound, and how a medical image had unlocked something procedural, something legal. The doctor hadn't panicked because of illness. He'd panicked because of authority being misused. That distinction mattered now more than ever. I stopped at a quiet diner I hadn't been to in years. Familiar places felt safer, not because they protected me, but because they reminded me who I was before this started. I ordered coffee and sat in a booth facing the window, watching cars pass, wondering how many lives were being quietly reorganized without consent at that very moment. Mine wasn't special. It was just finally visible to me. My phone buzzed. A message from her. Simple. Where are you? No accusation. No concern. Just data gathering. I waited before responding. Then I typed, "Out for a bit." Nothing more. Her reply came quickly. "We need to talk." That sentence had changed meaning entirely. Now it meant deadlines. While I sat there, another message came in, from a number I still didn't recognize. It said, "You did the right thing by leaving." That confirmation sent a chill through me. Someone was watching closely enough to know I'd stepped out of line. I realized then that my movements were already part of a larger calculation, one that included people I hadn't met, and conversations I hadn't heard. I finished my coffee and paid in cash. Routine mattered. I didn't want digital footprints leading back too clearly just yet. I drove to a small public park and sat in the car, reading through the photos I'd taken of the documents again. Each page represented a future where my voice was optional. I thought about how easily trust is weaponized when paperwork is involved. I called a lawyer, recommended years ago by a coworker, someone I'd never needed until now. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I asked one question: how fast could forged consent remove someone's legal authority? The answer was unsettling, faster than I expected. Faster, if the person remained cooperative, or unaware. Silence, again, was the accelerant. The lawyer advised me to stay away temporarily and not confront anyone yet. Hearing the same guidance from a second authority confirmed the danger. This wasn't paranoia. It was timing. I asked what my first step should be. He said documentation and witnesses. I realized then that the doctor's warning hadn't been the beginning. It had been the interruption of a process already underway. When I checked my phone again, there were multiple messages from her, each one slightly more insistent. Still calm, still controlled, no anger. That absence spoke volumes. Anger would have meant improvisation. Calm meant the plan was still intact. I didn't reply this time. As the afternoon stretched on, I felt the weight of becoming temporary in my own life. Every hour away from home changed the balance slightly. I wondered how long before she escalated, before she used the documents she believed were ready. I wondered who would support her version of events, and who would question it. The unknown stacked up quickly. I received a voicemail from the clinic. It said my wife had requested updated records and needed confirmation of my availability. The phrasing was careful. Confirmation, not permission. I deleted the message without responding. Each ignored request bought me time, but it also raised suspicion. Time cuts both ways. I realized then that leaving wasn't enough. Distance alone wouldn't stop the machinery already turning. I needed leverage, not revenge, not exposure. Leverage that forced hesitation, something that made proceeding risky for them. The thought settled in my chest, heavy but clear. As evening approached, I understood that I couldn't stay invisible forever. This phase of silence had an expiration. Soon I would have to speak, not emotionally but strategically. The danger hadn't passed. It had simply shifted locations. I sat there watching the sky dim, knowing that when I returned, nothing would be the same. Not because she'd changed, but because I had. And that difference was about to matter. I returned after dark, not because it was safer, but because silence reveals more than daylight ever does. The house looked unchanged, lights low, door unlocked, like an invitation rehearsed in advance. I stepped inside slowly, listening for movement, measuring my own breathing. She was in the living room, sitting upright, hands folded, television muted. She didn't ask where I'd been. She said my name once, calmly. Like a conclusion, that tone told me she believed something irreversible had already happened, and she was ready to move forward without me fully present. In that moment, my absence already felt recorded. I sat across from her, keeping distance between us, like a boundary neither of us named. She said she'd been worried, but her eyes were steady, not searching. I realized worry would have been messy. This was clean. She told me the clinic had called again, that they needed clarity. Clarity meant compliance. I asked what she wanted from me. She said she wanted things to be easier, as if difficulty had been my fault. The way she framed it made resistance sound unreasonable, almost cruel. I felt language being used to corner me carefully, without urgency or visible anger. I told her I needed time. She nodded too quickly, accepting it before I finished speaking. That told me time was no longer mine to request. She stood and said she'd be staying elsewhere for a bit, framing it as space for both of us. The decision landed fully formed, not negotiated. I didn't argue. Arguing would have confirmed I was still playing the old role. I watched her pack a small bag, efficient, prepared, like this version of the future had been practiced privately, long before the ultrasound ever entered our shared vocabulary or my awareness. As reality shifted, when she left, the house exhaled. I felt it immediately, the absence lifting pressure, rather than creating loneliness. That reaction told me how compressed I'd been living. I sat down and called the lawyer again, updating him on the documents and her behavior. He told me separation created opportunity, not failure. He warned me not to re-enter negotiations without protection. Hearing someone name it negotiation clarified everything. Marriage had already been replaced by leverage and timing. That shift frightened me less than pretending nothing fundamental had changed, while systems quietly advanced around us without my consent or emotional input anymore. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, tones, silences. I wrote until my hand cramped, afraid that memory alone wouldn't hold under pressure. Each detail felt like proof of existence. I realized then how easily people like me disappear not through force, but through procedure. Forms replace voices. Authority replaces presence. By the time you object, the narrative has already been filed. I promised myself that wouldn't happen quietly, because silence had already been weaponized against my life once, and I refused repetition through patience, masquerading as cooperation from this point forward now. The following hours were quiet, but not calm. Messages stopped. Calls stopped. That silence wasn't relief. It was recalibration. I knew she was adjusting strategy, accounting for my absence. I stayed where I was, resisting the urge to fill the gap with explanations. The lawyer called back and said he'd found irregularities already. That confirmation hit hard. It meant intervention was justified. It also meant escalation was inevitable. And escalation never ends gently, especially when reputations, control, and long planning are involved on both sides of a collapsing marriage where power resists exposure fiercely until forced otherwise by evidence alone. I realized then that revenge wasn't my instinct. Correction was. I didn't want her punished. I wanted the process stopped. There's a difference people overlook. Revenge is loud. Correction is precise. Precision requires patience, and patience had already been weaponized against me once. I would not repeat that mistake. I began planning my re-entry carefully, deciding what to reveal and what to withhold. Information would now move on my terms. Even if that unsettled every assumption she felt confident, relying upon after years of predictable partnership, mistaken for permanent compliance within our shared history that now fractured beyond repair lines. I slept briefly, not deeply, knowing the next phase would begin with contact. Sure enough, my phone lit up just after waking. She wanted to meet. Neutral place. Neutral tone. That neutrality was the tell. It meant she thought she could still manage the outcome. I agreed. Not because I trusted her, but because presence mattered again. Avoidance had served its purpose. Now visibility would disrupt expectations, especially if I arrived prepared with counsel, documentation, and resolve. Hardened by recent discoveries, she believed, remained hidden behind medical language and procedure, no longer effective shields for controlling outcomes in daylight conversation. As I got ready, I felt the danger sharpen, rather than fade. This meeting wouldn't resolve anything. It would reposition everything. I understood now that truth alone isn't power. Timing is, and for the first time since that ultrasound room, timing wasn't exclusively hers. That balance, fragile and temporary, was enough to proceed. I stepped out knowing the story was about to change direction again, not toward peace, but toward confrontation, carefully disguised as cooperation, where stakes would finally surface openly, without protective layers of politeness, or assumed marital trust, that once defined us before authority intervened and reshaped consent. This was no longer about leaving or staying. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own life. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had matured, and I could feel with unsettling clarity that the next conversation would trigger consequences neither of us could fully control. Whatever she expected, it wasn't compliance. Whatever I expected, it wasn't forgiveness. We were approaching the moment where intentions become irreversible actions, and once crossed, there would be no quiet way back from decisions already set into motion by hidden hands and documents prepared without mutual consent or transparent moral ground between us both any longer. I arrived early and chose a table where I could see the door, not because I feared her, but because I needed awareness back. Control begins with sight. When she walked in, she paused for half a second, just enough to register surprise. She hadn't expected me to look calm. That pause mattered. It told me she was measuring a version of me that no longer fit her expectations. She sat down without greeting me, placing her bag carefully at her feet like someone protecting property. I noticed she'd brought papers. I hadn't. That difference shifted the air immediately. She started by saying she wanted this to be respectful. I let the word hang there. Respect is often used when someone wants compliance without resistance. She spoke about stress, about confusion, about how things had gotten misunderstood. I listened without interrupting, watching how she framed events. Every sentence positioned her as caretaker, me as obstacle. When she mentioned the ultrasound, she called it a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. That was the first lie she told out loud, and she said it comfortably. I asked her one question. I asked when she planned to activate the documents. She froze, not dramatically, just enough. Her eyes dropped to the table before returning to mine. She asked what documents I meant. I told her the power of attorney forms. I told her I had copies. That was the moment everything changed. Her shoulders tightened. The calm she'd brought in cracked. Just slightly, but enough to reveal panic underneath. She told me I was mistaken, that I must have misunderstood paperwork meant to protect us both. I asked why my signature appeared dated when I hadn't signed anything recently. She didn't answer directly. She talked instead about how hard the past months had been. That deflection confirmed intent. Innocent people explain, guilty people redirect. I didn't accuse her further. I didn't need to. The silence between us grew heavier than words. She leaned forward and lowered her voice, reminding me of how things would look if I made this public. She mentioned my health, my age, my stress. That was the threat. not spoken outright, but implied. She was telling me she could frame concern as incapacity. That realization burned, not with anger, but with clarity. This wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural, and procedures can be challenged if you know where to press. I told her I'd already spoken to a lawyer. That was true. I told her irregularities had been flagged. That was also true. What I didn't tell her was how quickly those flags could turn into formal intervention. I watched her calculate. She asked if this was revenge. I told her it wasn't. I told her it was correction. That word unsettled her more than accusation would have. Revenge implies emotion. Correction implies process, and process cuts both ways. She asked what I wanted. The question sounded simple, but it wasn't. I told her I wanted all documents withdrawn, immediately, and full transparency about who else had been involved. Her jaw tightened. She said she needed time. I told her time was no longer available. I could see the shift as she realized I wasn't negotiating from fear anymore. I don't think hate to leverage. Without it, she was exposed. She stood abruptly, saying this conversation was over. I let her go. Letting her leave was power. Chasing would have handed it back. As she walked out, I understood something important. The ultrasound hadn't revealed illness. It had revealed opportunity. Opportunity to move quietly, legally, decisively. The doctor had seen that and interrupted it, not because of loyalty to me, but because misuse of authority carries consequences for everyone involved. I stayed seated long after she left, grounding myself in the fact that I'd spoken without shaking. That mattered. I called the lawyer again and updated him. He told me to prepare for escalation. That word no longer frightened me. Escalation meant visibility. Visibility meant protection. Silence had almost erased me. I wouldn't return to it. That evening, messages started again. Not from her, but from others. Family asking if everything was okay. Concern framed as curiosity. I recognized the pattern. Narratives were being seeded. I responded politely, minimally, no denials, no confirmations. Ambiguity protects better than outrage. I could feel the story fracturing, no longer controlled by one voice. As night settled, I realized the danger had shifted again. It was no longer about documents being activated quietly. It was about perception being shaped quickly. I understood then that the next move wouldn't be legal. It would be social. And social consequences can be just as final if you're unprepared. I sat alone, considering how close I'd come to losing everything without realizing it. The ultrasound room felt distant now, but its impact remained. It had been the trigger, not the cause. The cause was entitlement to decide my life without me. That entitlement had been challenged, not defeated. I knew the next phase would require something harder than silence or patience. It would require exposure, not dramatic, strategic, controlled. And once exposure begins, there is no undoing it. The danger wasn't ending. It was transforming. I didn't announce what I was about to do, because announcements invite interference. I spent the morning organizing what I had already collected, not adding drama, not filling gaps with emotion, just aligning facts in the order they occurred. Dates mattered. Signatures mattered. Silence mattered. I realized that truth only works when it's clean. Messy truth gets dismissed as bitterness. Clean truth forces response. By the time I finished, I knew I wasn't exposing her. I was correcting a record that had already been written without me. I sent one message to the lawyer confirming I was ready. He replied with a single word, "Proceed." That was enough. The first step wasn't public. It was procedural. Formal notices were sent, filings paused, authorizations challenged, quiet actions, but irreversible ones. Once triggered, systems move forward even if people panic. I felt the weight lift slightly, not because the danger was gone, but because it was no longer invisible. Her response came later than expected. When it did, it wasn't angry. It was controlled outrage, wrapped in concern. She accused me of misunderstanding her intentions, of escalating unnecessarily, of hurting us both. I didn't reply. The time for conversation had passed. This was no longer a misunderstanding between spouses. It was a conflict between versions of reality, and one of them now had documentation. Family reactions followed. Some reached out cautiously. Others went silent. Silence didn't bother me anymore. I understood it as self-protection, not judgment. Narratives spread fast, but facts spread deeper. I didn't correct rumors. I didn't defend myself. Defense implies guilt. I stayed consistent, calm, and available. That posture unsettles people more than denial ever could. The clinic contacted me formally, requesting clarification. I provided it through counsel. The doctor's involvement became clearer then. He hadn't acted out of fear for me alone. He'd recognized a pattern he'd seen before. Patients stripped of voice under the language of care. He'd intervened because he knew how fast it happens and how rarely it stopped once begun. I felt gratitude without needing to express it. Some interventions are meant to remain anonymous. As the process advanced, I felt something unexpected settle in. Not victory, not relief. Agency, the simple knowledge that my life was no longer being edited without my input. That knowledge was grounding. It didn't erase what had happened, but it prevented repetition. And prevention, I realized, is the quiet form of justice most people never talk about. When we finally spoke again, it was brief and procedural. No apologies. No confessions. Just boundaries. The marriage as it had existed was already over. That fact hurt less than I expected. Betrayal drains attachment, long before separation makes it official. I didn't seek closure. Closure implies mutual agreement. I sought clarity. I had it. The ultrasound no longer haunted me. It made sense now. It wasn't about illness. It was about timing, about accelerating a plan under cover of medical authority. Once I understood that, the fear lost its power. Fear thrives in confusion. Clarity starves it. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt quietly. Not my life, but my footing. I learned who respected process and who preferred shortcuts. I learned how easily care can be weaponized. Most importantly, I learned that silence is only safe when it's chosen, not imposed. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because people like me rarely realize what's happening until their signature is no longer required. By then it's too late. I wasn't lucky. I was interrupted. That interruption saved me. If there's a lesson here, it's not about marriage or medicine. It's about attention. The moment someone asks you to stop asking questions, pay closer attention. The moment your voice is framed as inconvenience, reclaim it. I did, and that made all the difference.